Hello, in this final video presentation, there are 3 cases spoken by different persons, and I'm Liu Chenyu, who is major in accounting, and my student ID number is 114303057. So today I will be presenting my analysis on case 1, quantity easing policy, and we will examine how this unconventional monetary tool evolved in the United States and Japan, differentiate it from conventional policies, and analyze its mechanisms through the microeconomic models, including the money market and the ADAS frameworks. So let's look at question 1, which compares these historical paths on QE, and the fundamental difference lies in their underlying economic motives. The US adopted QE as a shock-driven crisis response. For example, QE1 targets the 2008 subprime meltdown, while QE4 in 2020 was a rapid injection to prevent credit markets from freezing during the pandemic. On the other hand, Japan utilized QE as a chronic structural tool against its lost decades on deflation. Japan pioneered the policies in 2001, and by 2013, under Prime Minister Abe, the Bank of Japan launched QQE, which is quantitative and qualitative monetary easing, and this shifted the strategy from merely injecting bank reserves to aggressively purchasing risky private assets, explicitly aiming to shock the public out of deflationary mindset and hit a steady 2% inflation target. So let's move on to the question 2. How does QE fundamentally differs from unconventional monetary policy? Under normal conditions, conventional policies is price target, and the central bank used tools like adjusting the discount rate, lowering the reserve requirement, or conducting the short-term open market operations to guide the short-term market rates. However, when short-term interest rates hit the zero lower bound, the conventional levers break, and this is where QE comes in the quantity target policy. Instead of trying to lower the price on money directly, the central bank prints money to directly expand its asset balance sheet, and the tools switch from the short-term interventions to the large-scale asset purchase of long-term government debt. And in Japan's case, quantity risky assets like ETFs, essentially the central bank bypasses the banking sector to inject liquidity directly into the broader capital markets. And question 3 introduces the concept of liquidity trap, and this occurs when the nominal interest rate drops so low that the opportunity cost of holding cash becomes virtually zero, and people expect the interest rate to only rise in the future, which means the bond price will fall. So therefore, the public holds cash, and the money demand curve becomes perfectly horizontal, as illustrated in this market diagram. If the central bank tried to use conventional policy to shift the money supply from the MS1 to MS2, the interest rate remains at the same place, and the economy swallows the extra money like a sponge without lowering interest rates or stimulating the investment. So because the conventional policy is rendered powerless here, so QE becomes a structural necessity. QE doesn't care about the flat short-term rate. It bypasses it entirely to lower long-term interest rate by buying up long-term assets. So let's analyze the question 4 regarding the transmission channel of QE and how it manifests in the ADS model. So how does printing money turn into GDP growth from the US or 2% inflation rate from Japan? It flows through four major channels. Three major channels. So first, the interest rate channel drops long-term loans and mortgage costs, prompting U.S. firms to invest and households to consume. Second, the West effect drives up stock and real estate valuations, making consumers feel wealthier and spend more. So third, via the exchange rate channel, a massive currency expansion caused the domestic currency to depreciate. This was highly visible during Japan's QQE when a weaker yen spiked corporate next export. So, in the ADA's framework shown here, both countries start in a recessionary or deflationary gap at equilibrium E1. As these three transmission channels activate, consumer spending, business investment, and next export surge. This forced the aggregate demand curve to shift rightward from 81 to 82. Consequently, we move to a new equilibrium E2. So successfully expanding the real GDP from the U.S. economy and driving the price level up towards Japan's 2 inflation target. So that's the end of case 1. Next, Li Yilin, who is from Department of European Language and Culture, will take over to explain the question 2.
Hi, I'm Li Ling and I'm from Department of European Language and Cultures. Later, we will analyze Taiwan's recent macroeconomic performance. In 2025, Taiwan emerged as a global ambassador of the AI revolution, driving an annual real GDP growth rate that exceeded 8%, with a quarterly peak surpassing 8.1%. Driven by a near monopoly on advanced semiconductor infrastructure, Taiwan GDP per capita historically surpassed both South Korea and Japan for the very first time in over 2 decades. Alright, based on this background, in the next few minutes, we will utilize the core macroeconomic framework to dissect this AI-driven economic miracle. For the first question, how AI altered the components of Taiwan's GDP? Let's recall the GDP formula. GDP equals output Y equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net export. In this case, the biggest change happens in investment, the next export, and the consumption. The first one, for the investment, there was a huge spending from both domestic side and the foreign side. On the foreign side, foreign direct investment skyrocketed because the global tech giants came to Taiwan to build physical long-term facilities. For example, like NVIDIA, they invest 1.27 billion on its Constellation R&D center, while Google and Amazon expanded their data center here. Domestically, private investment hit a historic peak because TSMC fast-tracked its spending to build advanced 2 nano factories and packing plants. The second one is the next export. Taiwan trade shifted heavily towards North America. In fact, the monthly export of high-end AI servers and advanced chip has doubled by the mid-2025. Finally, the consumption. This boom spilled over to everyday citizen through a soaring stock market. This created a powerful wealth effect, which we will talk about this later, that heavily boosted the private consumption. And people, they buy more luxury goods and service. In short, Taiwan's historic GDP growth was powered by investment, net export, and consumption rising all together. The second question, the AI boom on Taiwan's economy. To liberate this, we will need the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply models. First, on the demand side, the massive jump in consumption, corporate investment, and the cheap export shift the AD curve sharply to the right. On the supply side, TSMC massive investment in new factories weren't just a short-term spending. They permanently they permanently expand Taiwan's total physical capacity to produce goods. This caused both long-term aggregate supply curve and the short-term aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. In the short run, this double shift caused a definite explosive increase in real GDP from Y1 to Y2, and which explains our recorded 8% GDP growth rate. As for the price level, while the higher demand pulled up the price up, the increased supply helped offset that. Therefore, the net impact on the price level is theoretically ambitious, allowing Taiwan to achieve a perfect combination of a high growth rate but with a stable inflation at the same time. Alright, before we take a look at the first part of the second question, let's take a look at the two different types of investment that happens in Taiwan. Firstly is the foreign direct investment, FDI. FDI is the cross-border long-term investment made to establish a lasting presence and a physical control over the business. Like NVIDIA, they build their constellation R&D quarters center, and on the other hand, Google, Amazon, they're expanding the data center here. Secondly is the foreign portfolio investment, FPI. FPI is a short-term money moving into liquid financial assets such as bonds and stocks and so on. In the context, we can see that global investors pull billions into Taiwan's stock market to buy stock without owning or running the companies. As for the second part of the question 3, how capital inflows affect the value of New Taiwan dollar? In the foreign exchange market, whether it is FDI or FPI, foreign investors have to trade massive amount of US dollar for Taiwan dollar, and this triggers a right shift in the demand curve for the New Taiwan dollar. Simultaneously, with a fixed supply of the currency, this high demand caused a New Taiwan dollar to appreciate sharply. In other words, the Taiwan dollar becomes stronger. Usually, a stronger currency hurts export because it makes them more expensive. However, since Taiwan is the monopoly in producing advanced AI chips, the US tech giants had no choice but to pay a higher exchange cost. And this deeply locked in America's economic reliance on Taiwan to maintain its AI software dominance. This actually profoundly strengthening Taiwan's Silicon Shield. Finally, the last question. How exactly does a booming stock market turn into a real physical economic growth? Well, we can explain this by using a Keynesian consumption framework. A rising stock value greatly boosts consumers' confidence. In the theory, we distinguish the rising stock price increases the autonomous wealth, but not the regular disposable income. Because of this, the MPC, which is the slope of our AE curve, remained completely unchanged. And the stock market boom doesn't change the percentage of how much money a person spends out of their next dollar of the salary. Instead, this increase in wealthy directly increased the autonomous consumption. This means that even if a citizen's monthly salary stays exactly the same, they will spend more money overall. In the Keynesian cross model, the aggregate expenditure shifts parallel upward from AE1 to AE2, with the slope, the MPC, stay exactly the same. This upper shift immediately creates an unplanned decrease here in inventories because consumers are buying goods faster than the business expected. To fix this shortage, the firms must hire more workers and speed up physically production. Through this spending multiplier process, the virtual weight of the stock market successfully turned into a real physical economic activity, pulling the real GDP to grow up. Alright, above all was my presentation. Now I will pass the floor to my third group members, Pan Yo-wen.
Hello,
我是潘佑文，然后我的学号是114302028，然后我今天负责的报告是 Case 3。Okay, let's get started. Today I will be presenting Case 3, the USA Iron War and Oil Crisis, which covers energy supply shocks, stagflation, and the policy dilemmas. In early 2026, a conflict between the US and Iran led to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point through which nearly 20% of global oil flows daily. This removed around 20 million barrels per day from the market, causing oil price to surge from 70 to 120 per barrel, and US gasoline prices to jump 30% in just 2 months. Unlike a normal downturn where falling demand brings prices down, this was a supply shock. Supply was cut, so price rose even as the economy slowed, creating the conditions for stagflation. And let's move to the question 1. We compare this with the Russia-Ukraine war. The key difference is that the Russia-Ukraine war mainly disrupted European natural gas markets through pipeline routes, a regional impact with moderate price shock. The Iran-US conflict is far more severe for 3 reasons. The Strait of Hormuz is irreplaceable with no quick alternative route for that volume of oil. Crude oil is globally priced, so any disruption instantly affects prices worldwide, and higher oil price cascade into transportation, manufacturing, and agriculture costs across every sector and country, making the impact both faster and far more widespread. And the next question number 2, stagflation is defined as high inflation combined with economic stagnation, meaning rising costs of living, falling real GDP, and rising unemployment all at the same time. What makes it harder to manage than a standard recession is the policy contradiction it creates. To fight inflation, you need to raise rates, but that worsens the recession. To fight unemployment, you need to cut rates, but that worsens inflation. Any move to fix one problem makes the other worse, which is why stagflation is considered far more difficult to resolve than a typical downturn. And the question number 3 will use the AD and AS model to illustrate this. The supply shock causes energy prices to rise, which raises production costs, which shifts the SRS curve to the left. In the diagram, equilibrium moves from point A to point B. The price level rises as higher costs are passed on to customers, while real GDP falls as firms cut output. The AD curve stays in place because this is a poor quick supply side shock. And the result is exactly what stagflation looks like: price up, output down simultaneously. And finally, question 4 uses the Phillips curve framework. After the supply shock, the short-run Phillips curve shifts from SRPC to SRPC plane, moving the economy from point A, low inflation, low unemployment, to point B, where both are elevated. Standard monetary policy cannot fix both at once. Expansionary policy cuts rates and reduces unemployment, but inflation rises further. Contractionary policy raises rates and controls inflation, but unemployment worsens. The government must accept a trade-off between the two, and the only real solution is supply-side policy, like developing alternative energy sources or resolving the conflict, which takes time. That is exactly what makes stagflation so painful and persistent. In summary, the closure of Strait of Hormuz triggered a chain reaction from an energy supply shock to stagflation to an impossible policy dilemma, reminding us that energy security and geopolitical stability are inseparable from economic stability.
Thank you.